Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Mr. Strange, and tonight I'll be sharing 5 different horror stories that happened at a lake house that will give you nightmares if it ever happens to you. So stick with me till the end and enjoy the stories.
I'd been dating him for about 3 years when we decided to take that trip. We'd been going through one of those rough patches that every couple faces. You know, the kind where you're not fighting exactly, but everything feels strained and forced. I was working late most nights, coming home exhausted, and he was dealing with his own stress. We barely talked anymore except about groceries or when friends visits. My sister had been suggesting for months that we needed to get away together, just the two of us, somewhere quiet where we could reconnect. She'd rented this lake house upstate for her own family vacation the year before and kept saying how peaceful it was, how it might be exactly what we needed. I wasn't really convinced that a change of scenery would fix our problems, but I was tired of feeling like roommates instead of partners. The lake house was one of those places that felt completely isolated from the world. No cell service, the nearest neighbor about a quarter-mile away, and the closest town a good 40-minute drive. The house itself was nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom cabin with a wraparound porch and a private dock that stretched out into the water. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late July. The heat was brutal that summer, the kind that makes the air shimmer and your clothes stick to your skin the moment you step outside. But out there on the lake, with the breeze coming off the water, it actually felt bearable. We spent the first couple days trying to act like we were having fun, swimming, relaxing by the dock, grilling burgers on the ancient charcoal grill that came with the place. By Saturday, we'd settled into this comfortable routine. He'd wake up early and make coffee while I slept in. I'd spend the morning meditating while he tinkered with the old fishing rod we'd found in the shed. Afternoons we'd swim or take the kayaks out. Evenings we'd sit on the porch with beers and actually talk, really talk, for the first time in months. That's when we met them. This couple from the house next door had been having some kind of gathering all weekend. Not a wild party exactly, but a steady stream of people coming and going. Music playing, the sound of laughter carrying across the water. They seemed friendly enough when they waved from their deck, and we waved back. Sunday afternoon, the woman walked over to our place. She was maybe in her 40s, wearing this flowing sundress and oversized sunglasses, carrying a bottle of wine. She introduced herself and said they were having a few friends over that evening, nothing crazy, just drinks and good food, and would we like to join them? I looked at him, and he shrugged. So I said sure, why not? We'd been keeping to ourselves all weekend, and honestly, the idea of meeting some new people sounded appealing. We'd been in this bubble of forced intimacy for days, and maybe what we needed was to just relax and be social for a while. Plus, we'd brought nice clothes thinking we might drive into town for dinner one night, but we'd been too lazy to bother. The gathering was exactly what she'd promised, maybe a dozen people, all adults, sitting around their deck and dock area with drinks and appetizers. Everyone was friendly in that easy way that happens when you're all on vacation and nobody has anywhere else to be. There was this one guy who'd driven up from the city, talking about his sailing adventures. Another couple who'd been coming to this lake for 20 years, full of stories about how much it had changed. The hosts were generous with the drinks. The woman kept refilling our glasses before they were empty, and her partner was mixing these elaborate cocktails that tasted like fruit juice but obviously had plenty of alcohol in them. I remember thinking that we should probably pace ourselves since we weren't used to drinking that much, but everyone was so relaxed and friendly that it felt rude to decline. The last clear memory I have is sitting on their dock around sunset, watching the light play across the water while someone told this long, rambling story about a fishing trip gone wrong. I was feeling loose and happy in a way I hadn't in months. He was sitting next to me, his hand resting on my knee, and for the first time all weekend I felt like we might actually work through whatever had been wrong between us. Then nothing. Complete blank. Not even fragments or impressions, just a hard cut to black. I woke up in our own bed the next morning feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My head was pounding, my mouth felt like cotton, and there was this sick, dizzy feeling in my stomach that was worse than any hangover I'd ever had. He was still unconscious next to me, and when I tried to shake him awake, he just groaned and rolled over. It took me a while to realize that something was seriously wrong. My purse was on the kitchen counter, but my wallet was missing. His watch, which he'd left on the nightstand, was gone. The cash we'd brought for the trip, about $300 that we'd kept in an envelope in the bedroom drawer, had vanished. Even my ring, which I never took off except to shower, was no longer on my finger. When he finally woke up around noon, he was just as confused and sick as I was. Neither of us could remember anything after those drinks on the dock. We spent the rest of that day trying to piece together what had happened, checking the house for any other missing items, wondering if we should call the police. But what would we tell them? That we'd gotten drunk at a party and couldn't remember how we'd gotten home. We never saw those neighbors again. Their house was completely empty when we walked over there that afternoon. No cars in the driveway. No signs that anyone had been there at all. Now, I stay sober most times or drink just one beer, but I still wonder what else might have happened that we can't remember. My boyfriend and I never talked about what happened there except to agree that we'd never put ourselves in that position again. I'd been going to this same lake house every August for almost 15 years. It was a rental property that belonged to a family friend, situated on the western shore of a lake that stretched for miles in either direction. The house was just a modest 2-bedroom cottage with a wraparound porch and about 200 feet of private shoreline. What made this place special wasn't the house itself, but the sense of community that had developed over the years. Most of the properties around the lake were summer rentals or vacation homes, so you'd see the same faces year after year. People would wave from their docks, share tools and equipment, help each other out with boat repairs or directions to the best fishing spots. I'd gotten to know several of the regular renters pretty well. There was this couple from Philadelphia who always rented the big house at the north end of the cove, and a family with teenage kids who came up from New Jersey every summer. We developed these casual friendships based on shared meals, evening conversations on the dock, and the kind of easy camaraderie that happens when everyone is relaxed and on vacation. The lake itself was perfect for swimming, clear water, sandy bottom near the shore, and deep enough that you could dive off the end of most docks without worrying about hitting anything. The water temperature in August was usually in the mid-70s, warm enough that you could stay in for hours without getting cold. I'd always been a strong swimmer, been on the swim team in high school and college, so I was comfortable in the water even when other people weren't. I'd often swim out to the deeper parts of the lake in the early morning when the water was still and glass smooth, or in the evening when the sun was setting. That particular summer, I'd been at the lake house for about a week when I noticed this new group of people staying at the house directly across the cove from mine. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all probably in their 30s, driving a car with out-of-state plates. They seemed friendly enough when they'd wave from their deck, but they kept to themselves mostly. Unlike the regular summer crowd, these newcomers didn't seem interested in the usual lake activities. I never saw them swimming or fishing or taking out the kayaks that came with their rental. They spent most of their time on their deck, drinking and talking, sometimes playing music loud enough that it carried across the water to where I was sitting. One afternoon, probably around 3 o'clock, when I heard the screaming. I was inside resting, taking a break from the heat, when this voice cut through the quiet. Someone yelling for help from somewhere out on the lake. The sound was coming from the direction of the deep water, maybe a couple 100 yards from shore. I dropped what I was doing and ran out to the deck, scanning the water to see what was happening. I could see someone thrashing in the water, arms waving above the surface, clearly in distress. They were far enough out that I couldn't make out details, but the panic in their voice was unmistakable. Without thinking, I grabbed the life ring that hung on a post at the end of my dock and dove into the water. The person in trouble was maybe 150 yards out, in water that was probably 15 feet deep. I'm a strong swimmer, but even so, it took me several minutes to reach them. When I got there, I found one of the men from the house across the cove. He was clearly exhausted, gulping air and struggling to stay afloat. He managed to gasp out that he'd gotten a cramp in his leg and couldn't make it back to shore. I got the life ring around him and started towing him back toward his dock, which was closer than mine. The swim back took almost 10 minutes. He was dead weight, and even with the life ring, it was hard work pulling him through the water. By the time we reached his dock, I was exhausted too. The woman from his group was there waiting, helping to pull him up onto the dock, thanking me over and over for helping. I was breathing hard, treading water next to their dock, when I realized that something felt wrong. The man I'd just rescued didn't seem as exhausted as he should have been. He was sitting up on the dock, talking normally, not showing the kind of distress you'd expect from someone who'd just been struggling for their life in deep water. I swam back to my own dock, feeling uneasy, but not sure why. It wasn't until I climbed out of the water that I realized what had happened. My wallet and phone, which I'd left on the small table at the end of my dock before diving in to help, were gone. I stood there dripping wet, looking at the empty table where my things had been just 20 minutes earlier. The only people who could have taken them were the other member of that group from across the cove, the second man I hadn't seen during the rescue. They were gone by the time I got dressed and walked over to confront them, checkout time apparently having been that exact afternoon. I spent the rest of my vacation dealing with canceled credit cards and a new phone, but what really bothered me wasn't the inconvenience or the money. It was the realization that someone had watched me for days, studied my routines, and planned out exactly how to exploit the one thing I'd always believed in most about places like this: that when someone needs help, you help them without thinking twice about it. We'd bought the lake house 3 years earlier as an investment property, planning to rent it out during the summer season and use it ourselves during the off-peak times. It was located on the north shore of this pristine lake, about 3 hours from where we lived, in an area that had been popular with summer visitors since the early 1900s. The house itself was a classic 1960s ranch-style building, nothing fancy but well-maintained, with a large deck facing the water and about an acre of wooded property. The previous owners had lived there year-round for over 30 years before deciding to relocate closer to their grown children. They'd kept the place immaculate, and all the major systems had been updated within the past decade. What really sold us on the property was the waterfront. We had almost 300 feet of natural shoreline with a substantial dock that could accommodate a decent-sized boat. The water was deep enough for swimming right off the dock, and the bottom was sandy rather than rocky, which made it perfect for our kids when they visited. The rental business had been going well. We'd listed it online and typically booked it solid from Memorial Day through Labor Day. Most of our renters were families from the city looking for a quiet week or two by the water, and we'd gotten consistently good reviews. The income was enough to cover our mortgage and taxes, with a little left over for maintenance and improvements. We decided to spend most of that particular August at the house ourselves, taking a break from the rental income to just enjoy the place. It had been a stressful year. The first couple weeks were perfect. We fell into this relaxing routine of sleeping late, having coffee on the deck while watching the lake wake up, spending the day swimming or reading or working on small projects around the house. Evenings we'd sit outside until the mosquitoes drove us in, talking about our plans for retirement for the future. We'd been noticing the local wildlife more than usual that summer. There were always fish jumping in the early morning and evening, and we'd seen more birds than in previous years: herons, eagles, various ducks, and loons. The lake seemed especially alive, which made sense given how mild the winter had been and how much rain they'd gotten that spring. I was usually the first one awake, and I'd gotten into the habit of taking my coffee out to the dock to watch the sunrise. The water was typically glass smooth at that hour, and there was something peaceful about being the only person awake in that whole corner of the world. I'd sit on the bench at the end of the dock with my coffee and just soak in the quiet. That's how I first noticed them. It was a Tuesday morning, probably around 6:30, when I walked out to the dock and saw what looked like a dozen fish floating belly up in a rough circle around the end of the dock. They were all about the same size, maybe 8 or 10 inches long, and they'd obviously been dead for a while because they were starting to look pretty bad. I figured it was just one of those things that happens in nature, maybe a temperature change or low oxygen levels or some kind of disease. I got the long-handled net from the shed and spent about an hour scooping them up and disposing of them in the woods behind the house. It was unpleasant work, but I didn't want them floating around our swimming area. The next morning, they were back. Not fish this time, but birds. 7 or 8 small songbirds, arranged in that same rough circle pattern around the end of the dock. They looked like they'd been placed there deliberately, not like they'd just died and floated into position. Each one was lying on its back with its wings spread, forming this weird pattern that definitely wasn't natural. I cleaned those up too, but I was starting to feel uneasy about the whole thing. I mentioned it to my partner when she woke up, but she just shrugged and said that wildlife could be unpredictable, especially during hot weather. Maybe there was something in the water that was making animals sick, or maybe predators were leaving their kills behind for some reason. Thursday morning brought more fish, but this time they were arranged in a perfect circle, each one positioned exactly the same distance from the center point. Friday it was a mix of fish and birds, but again, that same circular arrangement that was impossible to explain as coincidence. By the weekend, I was getting up earlier and earlier, hoping to catch whatever was doing this. I'd sit in the kitchen with the lights off, watching the dock through the big picture window, but I never saw anything. Whatever was happening, it was happening in the dead of night, when even I wasn't awake to witness it. The pattern continued every single morning for 2 weeks. Sometimes all fish, sometimes all birds, sometimes a mix of both. Always arranged in that same circular pattern around the end of our dock. Always fresh, like whatever had killed them had done it just hours before dawn. We ended up leaving 3 days early, neither of us able to stomach another morning of cleaning up dead animals that someone or something had arranged like offerings around our dock. I still have no idea what was doing it or why, but I know I'll never forget the sick feeling I got every morning when I walked out there with that net, wondering what new horror was waiting for me in the water. We'd been going to the same lake house every summer for about 7 years. It was this perfect 2-story place on the eastern shore of a lake in upstate New York, surrounded by dense forest and far enough from the main road that you could pretend civilization didn't exist. The house belonged to a family friend who'd inherited it from her parents and was happy to rent it to people she trusted. The setup was ideal for our family. My husband and I could take the master bedroom upstairs. The kids had their own rooms on the main floor, and there was this huge screened-in porch that faced the water where we'd spend most of our time. The house came with kayaks, a small motorboat, and fishing gear, so we never had to worry about entertainment. Our kids were at that perfect age for lake vacations, old enough to swim competently and entertain themselves, but young enough that they still wanted to spend time with us. We developed all these family traditions around our lake week. Morning swims before breakfast, afternoon fishing competitions, evening campfires on the beach behind the house. That particular summer, we'd booked our usual 2 weeks in July. The weather had been perfect, sunny and warm but not oppressive, with enough breeze to keep the bugs manageable. We'd fallen into our familiar routine almost immediately. Lazy mornings, active afternoons, peaceful evenings watching the sunset from the porch. The house was surrounded by old-growth forest, mostly maple and oak trees that created this natural canopy over the property. During the day, the filtered sunlight created these beautiful patterns on the ground, and at night, the trees formed dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky. It was exactly the kind of setting that makes you understand why people choose to live in remote places. I'd always been a light sleeper, and I'd gotten into the habit of waking up around midnight most nights, usually because of some small sound, a loon calling across the lake, or a raccoon knocking over something on the deck. Most of the time, I'd just lie there listening to the night sounds until I fell back asleep, but sometimes I'd get up and walk around the house, checking on the kids or just looking out at the water. It was during one of these middle-of-the-night wanderings that I first noticed the reflections. I was standing in the kitchen, looking out the window that faced the forest behind the house, when I saw these tiny points of light scattered among the trees. They looked like reflections, the way light bounces off glass or metal, but there shouldn't have been any light sources back there in the middle of the woods. At first I thought it might be some kind of natural phenomenon, maybe due on spider webs catching the moonlight, or some kind of fungus that grew on the trees. The lights were small and stationary, scattered at different heights throughout the forest, twinkling slightly as if they were moving just barely in the breeze. I mentioned it to my husband the next morning, but he said he hadn't noticed anything unusual. The kids were completely focused on their plans for that day. They wanted to hike to the far end of the lake where there was supposed to be a rope swing, so nobody else seemed interested in my mysterious lights in the forest. The second night, I made a point of staying awake longer, watching the tree line from different windows throughout the house. The reflections were definitely there, and they seemed to be in slightly different positions than they'd been the night before. There were maybe a dozen of them visible from the kitchen window, and a few more that I could see from the living room. By the third night, I was getting genuinely curious. I decided to take a flashlight and walk back into the woods to see what was causing the reflections. The forest behind the house was relatively open at ground level, with thick canopy overhead, but not much undergrowth, so it was easy enough to walk between the trees even in the dark. What I found was a network of small mirrors, each one about the size of a dinner plate, attached to tree trunks at various heights. They were positioned to reflect light from the house back toward the windows, creating those mysterious twinkling points I'd been seeing. But mirrors weren't the only things attached to the trees. There were also cameras. Small, battery-powered trail cameras of the type hunters used to monitor game movements. They were camouflaged and positioned to have clear sight lines toward our house, toward the windows of the bedrooms where my family was sleeping. Some were aimed at the deck, others at the dock, others at the various windows that faced the forest. I counted at least 15 cameras and maybe 20 mirrors scattered throughout the woods behind our house. They'd been there for a while. Some of the mounting hardware was weathered, and a few of the cameras were partially overgrown with vines. Someone had spent considerable time and effort setting up this surveillance network, and they'd done it with enough skill that it had taken me 3 nights to even notice something was wrong. I never found out who had set up that surveillance system or how long they'd been watching our family, but I still check the tree lines whenever we stay anywhere remote now, looking for those telltale glints of reflected light that might mean someone is watching us from the shadows. This happened to me just last year, and I'm honestly still processing what it all means. I'm sharing it now because I need to tell someone, and maybe putting it out there will help me make sense of it all. So, my family owns a lake house that's been in our family for 3 generations. My grandfather built it back in the 1950s as a summer retreat, and it's been the center of our family gatherings ever since. Every major holiday, every important celebration, every time we need to come together for good news or bad, we end up at the lake house. The place sits on about 5 acres of mixed forest and meadow, with nearly a quarter-mile of pristine shoreline on what locals call the quiet side of the lake. There are only 4 other houses visible from our property, and the nearest neighbor is far enough away that you have to really listen to hear their boat motor or their dogs barking. I'd inherited the place 2 years ago when my grandmother passed away. She'd been the family matriarch, the one who organized all the gatherings and maintained all the traditions. After she died, it fell to me to keep the lake house running and to make sure it remained the center of our extended family's life. This particular trip was supposed to be a weekend of maintenance and preparation. Summer was winding down, and I wanted to get the house ready for the fall and winter seasons. There were gutters to clean, storm windows to install, and about a dozen small repairs that had been accumulating throughout the busy summer months. I'd driven up on a Thursday afternoon, planning to work through the weekend and head back to the city on Sunday evening. The weather was perfect for outdoor work, cool and dry with a light breeze that kept the bugs at bay. I'd brought a cooler full of food, a detailed list of projects, and enough tools to handle anything that might come up. The house had been empty for about 3 weeks, since the last family gathering in early September. Everything was exactly as we'd left it, clean and organized, with all the furniture covered and the valuable items secured. My grandmother had trained all of us to leave the place ready for the next visitor, and that habit had carried on after her death. I'd been there about 2 hours, just long enough to unpack my things and walk around the property to see what needed attention, when I heard a vehicle coming down our long gravel driveway. It was unusual to get visitors at the lake house, especially when nobody was expecting me to be there, but occasionally neighbors would stop by to check on things, or delivery drivers would get confused about addresses. The truck that pulled up to the house was one of those delivery vans, and the driver was a middle-aged woman wearing the standard uniform. She had a package under her arm and was checking her electronic device as she walked up to the front porch. When I opened the door, she seemed surprised to see someone there, like she'd been expecting to just leave the package and go. The package was addressed to current resident at our address, which was odd because we'd never gotten mail delivered directly to the lake house. Everything usually went to a post office box in the nearest town, and we'd pick it up when we were in the area. But the address was definitely correct, and the driver seemed confident that she was in the right place. After she left, I carried the package inside and set it on the kitchen table while I made myself some to eat. It was about the size of a shoebox, but much lighter, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address visible anywhere. The postmark was local, from the town about 15 miles away, but that didn't tell me much about who might have sent it. I was curious, but I was also focused on getting started on my project list while I still had good daylight. I figured the package could wait until evening when I was ready to relax. I spent the next several hours cleaning gutters, checking the roof for loose shingles, and testing all the outdoor electrical outlets to make sure everything was working properly. Around sunset, I finally opened the package. Inside was a box of wooden matches, the old-fashioned kind with the long stems that you might use to light a fireplace or oil lamps. They were good quality matches, the kind you'd buy at an outdoor store rather than a grocery store, wrapped in wax paper and packed in a sturdy cardboard box. Underneath the matches was a note written on plain white paper in neat handwriting. It said simply, "Enjoy your stay," with no signature or other identification. I thought it was a strange gift, but maybe it was from one of the neighbors who knew our family and was just being thoughtful. The lake house had several fireplaces, and we often had campfires on the beach, so matches were actually useful. I put them in the kitchen drawer with the other fire-starting supplies and didn't think much more about it. That night I stayed up late watching movies on the screened porch, listening to the loons calling across the water and enjoying the peace of being alone in such a beautiful place. I went to bed around midnight, tired from the day's work and looking forward to tackling the rest of my project list in the morning. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the smell of smoke. Not the pleasant smell of a fireplace or campfire, but the sharp, acrid smell of something burning that shouldn't be burning. I got up and looked out the bedroom window, and I could see orange light flickering behind the woodshed that sat about 50 yards from the main house. Someone was crouched down next to the shed, and I could see the small flame of what looked like a match or lighter in their hands. They were trying to set fire to the pile of kindling and split logs that I'd stacked against the side of the building earlier that summer. I called out from the window, and they ran off into the woods, disappearing so quickly that I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the smell of smoke was real, and when I got outside with a flashlight, I could see the scorch marks on the wood where they'd tried to get the fire started. I stayed awake the rest of the night with all the lights on, wondering who had sent those matches and whether they were still out there in the darkness, waiting for another chance to finish what they'd started.